has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Half of Australia's population is in lockdown and we are all sick of it. Would there be fewer lockdowns and fewer restrictions across the nation right now if vaccination rates were higher? Isn't the reason vaccination rates are not higher is because the Prime Minister failed to order enough vaccines when it counted and failed also to fix national quarantine?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. More than half of Australians aged over 16 have had their first dose of the vaccine. Mr Speaker, more than half. That's 1 and 2. Mr Speaker, 6 million doses of that vaccine now have been delivered in New South Wales. Mr Speaker, 2/3 of those have been delivered by the magnificent GPs and pharmacists who are doing this all around the country. Mr Speaker, there are more points of presence where you can get the vaccine in Australia today than you can get a Big Mac, Mr Speaker, around this country because of the excellent work that is being done by General Fruin, by the GPs, by the pharmacists, working together, states and territories together, to get this job done, Mr Speaker, to get this job done. And it's an important job to get done, because under the national plan, Mr Speaker, that would see 70% and 80% of the population vaccinated, that means Australia will be able to move forward. Australia will be able to move forward and live with this virus. And that's why it's so important, Mr Speaker, that people stand up for the plan rather than standing in the way of the plan, Mr Speaker, like those in the Labor Party seem intent on doing, as they come in here day after day, Mr Speaker, running down the vaccination program, running down those who are seeking to implement it, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The question went to—
No, you just need to state the point of order.
On relevance.
Yes,
well,
Leader of the Opposition.
Down.
Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. On relevance, the question went to too fewer vaccines. Not too many, too few. That's the problem we're in at the moment. That's where the question went to.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, in response to the Leader of the Opposition, who quite often gets up to make these gratuitous statements, which aren't points of order, they are political point scoring.
They
are political point scoring, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister couldn't be any more relevant to the question asked.
I just say to the Leader of the House, I'm not sort of taking closing arguments on relevance. I'm simply going to rule on the matter, and we don't have jury decisions on my rulings, thank heavens. But I'll just say to the Prime Minister, the question obviously went to policy matters. He has certainly started to make some accusations on the other with respect to the opposition. I do think what he's done so far is okay, because this question, as I've said before, had at its heart at the beginning an accusation, but he can't spend the rest of the answer on that subject matter. Prime Minister, I'm listening.
The national plan, which will see our vaccination levels rise to 70% to 80%, Mr Speaker, and enable Australians to move forward, not stay shut in. That will be achieved by continuing to get on with the job. It won't be achieved by the negativity of those opposite. It will be achieved by the positivity of the government and all those they're working with, Mr Speaker.
And I give the call to the member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please provide an update to the House on how the national plan is providing safety and confidence to Australians as they arm themselves with COVID-19 vaccines, ensuring that we make it through the pandemic? Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Braddon for his question, and I thank him for his service to our country. And just by way of referring to the member for Braddon, he'll be very pleased to know, as we were able to advise earlier today, that last night our Defence Forces, working together with the New Zealand Defence Forces, Mr Speaker, brought over 650 people out of Kabul last night. That was a tremendous effort by our people in Kabul and out of AMAB, Mr Speaker, and they're returning safely, and they will soon be on their way back to Australia. Mr Speaker, the national plan provides the certainty and provides the safety for Australians to move forward out of the lockdowns that we see before us now, which are necessary for this time, but enables them to see past the lockdowns. It enables them to see their ability to live with the virus in the future. Mr Speaker, I commend Qantas, because Qantas, I think, have encapsulated what that hope is about, what the national plan can achieve, Mr Speaker, because that's what the national plan is designed to realise. And I call on all of Australians, Mr Speaker, as they have been turning up each and every day, getting their jabs in the arm and bringing us closer and closer to that day. It gives Australians certainty, and it gives Australians the safety that is necessary to move forward. And it's not about a day. It's about the science and the protection that Australians will have by achieving those important vaccination rates of 70% and 80%, supported by preparing our health systems, ensuring there is care and caution for our most vulnerable, which is part of the plan, Mr Speaker. It is achieved by continuing to vaccinate, including children aged 12 to 15, Mr Speaker, who will be vaccinated alongside the adult population, and we expect that final advice from Atagi later this week. And I was updated today by General Fruin, who says the plans working with the states and territories to initiate that program are proceeding well, and we'll discuss those further later in the week. Over 300,000, Mr Speaker, or so I should say almost 300,000 yesterday. Some 6 million jabs in arms in New South Wales, 2/3 of those delivered by the GPs and the pharmacists doing such a magnificent job. 60% first dose in New South Wales and the ACT, 75% first dose for over 50s. This plan does give that hope and confidence that Australians are looking for. It is underwriting the confidence particularly of small businesses who want to look past these lockdowns. Small businesses don't want to have to survive, Mr Speaker, on government checks. They want their customers back, and that's what the plan achieves, Mr Speaker. Those Australians, Mr Speaker, want to return their hours in their jobs because they want to be getting wages, not COVID disaster payments. Those COVID disaster payments, Mr Speaker, have been great support to get Australians through, but the national plan means we will get out of this, Mr Speaker. We will move forward. Our plan is to get there, and we need to support and stick to that plan, not stand in the way of it like those opposite.
Just before, if just the Leader of the Opposition could take his seat, the member for Indi, if she could just take her seat for a second. Member for Indi, if the member for Indi could, no, just go and take her seat. Yeah, would be good. Sorry to interrupt, but it's just fortuitous. I'm just going to ask everyone in their seats if they can for a second. Yeah, you can grab a drink. Just want everyone in their seat just to look up at David Foote. It's a bit hard doing the official photograph at the moment, so he's just taking a few before question time gets too far away. That was the quietest it's been. I might get you to stay there, David. We might do that a few times. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Would Australia be closer to reopening if the Prime Minister had not failed his 2 jobs on vaccine and quarantine?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question, because he's made this reference once more, implying the Prime Minister of this country only has 2 jobs, Mr Speaker. And as I said before, anyone who thinks the Prime Minister of this country only has 2 jobs isn't up to the job, Mr Speaker. And I can say that because those of us, Mr Speaker, who have been dealing with one of the most serious situations that we've had to address during our time of government, and that is to seek the evacuation of what has almost been 1,700 people out of Kabul right now, Mr Speaker, they would understand that a Prime Minister at any given time has more than 2 jobs, Mr Speaker. And that matter is the one, Mr Speaker, that we have been particularly applied on in this most recent week. And I want to thank again those Australians on the ground in Kabul right now doing that very important job at one of the most sensitive times of the mission that they have. But, Mr Speaker, as we continue to move forward and deal with those issues, Mr Speaker, as we continued to have done that over these many months with 430 individuals, Afghans and their families, brought to this country well before this crisis even hit, Mr Speaker, before this crisis even hit in the most recent iteration. And now we have moved into that evacuation mode. We have continued, Mr Speaker, to reduce taxes on those working in this country. We have continued, Mr Speaker, with the many jobs, because it is inferred by those opposite,
Just say to the Prime
Minister,
Minister, he just needs to— I know the point he made at the start of the answer, but it can't be the rest of the answer, he needs to bring him back to the two policy issues in the question. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker. And so, as the government has dealt with the many responsibilities that we have, from national security to ensure we're dealing with COVID, Mr Speaker—
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. As I said to the Prime Minister, he needs to bring himself back to the subject matters on the question. I don't need the member for Franklin to be interjecting at all. The Prime Minister has the call.
As I was saying, as we are dealing with these many responsibilities, in relation to the COVID response, our government has worked with governments around this country to achieve two very significant things for the Australian people, saving over 30,000 lives. I note the ghast by the Leader of the Opposition with his interjection, Mr Speaker. This is a Leader of the Opposition who always hopes for the worst, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition can't see on a point of order, but I'll hear him, the Leader of the Opposition, on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker.
Yes.
On a point of order, goes to relevance. The question wasn't about his capacity.
I've
asked
the Prime Minister to come back, and he was doing that. What I'd suggest is, yeah, well, if people didn't sort of interject and try and, okay, the Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will come back to the question and be relevant to it, and not worry about any commentary that he has in his mind. The Prime Minister
Thank you,
will be
Mr
relevant
Speaker.
to
The government has continued to implement our plans and our response to the COVID pandemic, which has seen us save 30,000 lives with the help of Australians and their sacrifices all around the country, and has ensured that 1 million Australians have been able to get back to work, Mr Speaker, and to be supported in those jobs. And even as we've gone through these lockdowns, we've been able to continue to support them with the support payments, over $3 billion of which paid out to support people getting through these lockdowns. These are the important tasks as we continue through the COVID pandemic. And importantly, Mr Speaker, the national plan that ensures that 70% and 80% we will be able to live with this virus. And that means we need to adjust our mindset. And all of us need to support Australians to adjust their mindset as we go into these additional phases of this plan. And, Mr Speaker, these are the challenges that we've been overcoming. These are the results we are getting. The vaccination program now, Mr Speaker, the vaccination program now running at levels that on a 7-day average per capita
time has concluded. And I give the call to the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government is guaranteeing essential products and services are being delivered across the country as we continue to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Mallee for a question and note her hard work in fighting for the Murray Basin Rail Project, the South West Loddon Mallee Rural Supply Line, and also her dramatic work and incredible work that she did with AG Visa. But, Mr Speaker, the member for Mallee not only fights there, but the $75 million for the Calder Highway, the $4 million for the Sea Lake Robinvale Road, was a notorious road in the north of her electorate, or even the Oyen Mildura, a new overtaking lane. From the small to the big, the member for Mallee has been fighting hard for the services that keep the product moving. The services are absolutely vital. They're vital, and we have, in the last week, completed the update of the National Freight Code. Mr Speaker, the National Freight Code is vitally important because it's for the movement of the product, movement of your groceries, movement of your meat, movement of your milk, movement of the product that's required for you to make dinner. And one of the greatest ways to keep people safe and secure is to keep them fed. And this nation and this government has been working to make sure that we don't disrupt people's lives more than is the least amount required. And we are doing that by reason of making sure that not only are we keeping people fed in Australia, but we're moving product to keep them fed around the world. We're moving them to keep them fed around the world by support of so many aviation packages so that we have the capacity to move product around the world by airlines still. We are moving product around the world to help feed our neighbours. And what's important for that is the terms of trade is which ultimately underpins this nation. Every person in this building, Mr Speaker, can look at their lives and see product that's imported, product that comes off a boat. And for product to come off a boat, someone has to put product on the boat, and that's done by the people of the hinterland. And now we are seeing record prices in beef, record prices in sheep, record prices in lamb, record prices in goat, the most consumed meat in the world. Very good prices in canola and wheat, earning wealth for our nation so we can support the budget to support our nation. But, of course, it is not just that. Right now, one of the greatest services is health services. And in the last 7 days per capita, we are rolling out more vaccines, so I believe, Mr Prime Minister, than the US or the UK per capita. That is an incredible outcome and shows the diligence of this government. The diligence of this government to get pharmacies moving, vaccinating people, the diligence of this government to get GPs, the diligence of this government to have over half our nation with one inoculation. We want people to get their liberties and the freedoms of their lives back. We acknowledge the frustrations they have. We want to make sure that as quickly as possible we get back to the lives that we have lived, and this government will do that.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister support the vaccination incentives of cash payments of $200 to Telstra employees and bonuses to Qantas customers? Wouldn't we get to reopen more quickly if the Prime Minister adopted Labor's plan of a $300 incentive payment for vaccinations?
The Leader of the House, the Prime Minister, has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, what commercial companies do, Mr Speaker, is a matter for them. But, Mr Speaker, no, I don't agree that for the 50% of those aged over 16, Mr Speaker, we should have paid a payment to because they understood. They knew, Mr Speaker, Australians are coming forward every single day in record numbers, Mr Speaker, as we've seen the vaccination rate continue to climb each and every week. Some 1.8 million vaccine doses administered last week. 1.8 million last week. Now, per capita, that is, over a 7-day period, a stronger rate of vaccination than both the UK or the United States achieved at their peak. At their peak, Mr Speaker. That is the rates at which our vaccination program is now performing. Now, the Leader of the Opposition might want to engage in a cash splash for whatever reason. A cash splash, Mr Speaker. He would have just written a cheque for $3 billion already for things that people were already going to do. Now, Mr Speaker, that says a lot about how Labor would have managed this COVID pandemic. It says a lot about their judgment. It says a lot about how they manage the nation's finances. They would actually make a payment for things that people were already going to do. But worse than that, as I said a few weeks ago, Mr Speaker, as I said a few weeks ago, it is a vote of no confidence in Australians. That's what it is, Mr Speaker, because I have confidence that Australians will continue to come forward, as indeed they are, because I'll tell you why they are coming forward, Mr Speaker, because they know, because of the national plan that we've set out, that 70% and 80% vaccination rates will mean they'll be able to go forward and live with this virus and not have to live with lockdowns. That's what they know, Mr Speaker, and that's why they're coming forward every week, every day, to all of those points of presence around the country to get their vaccinations. And I say thank you to them. And that's all they're seeking, Mr Speaker, and possibly not even that, because they know that it's the right thing to do for themselves, for their families, for their communities, to get Australia where they want to go. They're not coming forward for the cash, Mr Speaker. They're coming forward because it's in their public health interest to do so. They're doing it because they know it's the right thing to do by their communities. Mr Speaker, it is a cynical position of the Leader of the Opposition to want to use taxpayers' money to issue a vote of no confidence in Australians. That's the values of Labor, Mr Speaker. The values of the Liberals and the Nationals is to believe in the Australian people, that they want to do the right things in the national interest. That's the policies of our government, Mr Speaker. So I will leave the Labor leader to his policy folly. I will leave him to his policy folly, Mr Speaker, and we will stay. we will stay with the proven policies and the proven faith in the Australian people. Mr Speaker, we are standing up for the national plan. Labor seems to be standing in the way.
And I give the call to the member for Clark. Member for Clark, we can see you. Might have his microphone. Member for Clark. Might just go to the next question and then we'll make it up. I'll call the member for MONCRIEFF while broadcasting.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government's significant economic support, combined with real momentum of the vaccine rollout, will ensure greater business certainty in the future as restrictions are eased and lockdowns become more unlikely? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for MONCRIEFF for her question, acknowledge her experience in small business before coming to this place. And indeed, there are lots of businesses in the honourable member's electorate that are doing it very tough right now, particularly in the tourism sector. That is why the Morrison government joined with the Queensland State Government in a $600 million support package for small businesses across her electorate and indeed across the wider state of Queensland. Now, Mr Speaker, the last 18 months have been very difficult for Australians. Businesses have closed, people have been working from home, and kids haven't been able to join their classmates in the classroom. And we have responded to this crisis with an unprecedented amount of economic and health support. And most recently, that economic support has took the form of a COVID disaster payment of up to $750 a week for people who have lost hours of work. $4 billion out the door to 1.6 million Australians. And with every state and territory, we have reached an agreement to provide business support on a 50-50 funding split. Now, Mr Speaker, that economic support is absolutely vital in the immediate short term in enabling those businesses to survive and those families to get through the crisis. But it's not a sustainable long-term solution, government support. The only sustainable long-term solution to this crisis is that we stick to the plan agreed at National Cabinet, Mr Speaker. 70% and 80% vaccination rates, which are now in sight. Now, the Australian people are keeping their end of the bargain. They are rolling up their sleeves in record numbers to get the jabs, 215 jabs a minute across the country. It's up to the state premiers and to the chief ministers, together with the Prime Minister, to stick to the plan that was agreed at National Cabinet, Mr Speaker, because that plan is a pathway out of this crisis. And we heard today from the world-leading Doherty Institute that whether you start with 30 cases or 800 cases, you can open up safely. That is what the Doherty Institute said today. And the Doherty Institute also said zero COVID forever is unrealistic, Mr Speaker. That's the conversation that the Australian people need to hear, that it's a fallacy that you can eliminate COVID. You must learn to live with it, just as other countries are doing right now and just as we in Australia have done so with other infectious diseases.
I'll now give the call to the member for Clark.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the governments of Menzies, Holt, McEwen, Gorton and McMahon were responsible for the Vietnam disaster. John Howard took us to war in Iraq on a lie. And the Howard, Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull and your government own the Afghanistan tragedy. In other words, history shows decisions to go to war are not something any government nor PM can be trusted with. Yes, it is important they have authority to deploy the ADF in a crisis, but surely it should be Parliament alone with authority to declare and continue war. So, Prime Minister, will you follow the lead of other democracies, reform war powers and ensure it's Parliament calling the shots in future?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I, with respect, thank the member for his question, and I know he's held this view for a long time and advocated it in this place. But the government believes in what is set out in the Australian Constitution, and that is the power to make war, deploy troops and declare police are part of the executive powers of the Commonwealth, and executive power is recognised in Section 61 of the Constitution. I believe that all those who have served, and I have no doubt the member would believe this also, in whatever conflict that we've been engaged in, that they have fallen in the name of Australia, in the name of freedom, in the name of our values, and seeking to pursue the national interests of Australia and to keep Australians safe. And whether that is in Afghanistan or whether that is in Vietnam or the many other conflicts referred to by the member, all of their sacrifice has been great and has made Australia stronger. And I'll ask the Minister for Defence to add to the answer.
The Minister for Defence.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and the only thing that I'd add in addition to the Prime Minister's comments, firstly, obviously the government of the day takes the advice of the Chief of the Defence Force and all of those experts that form part of the National Security Committee, looking at our domestic and our international equities and make decisions based on the best advice. And I think the best message, frankly, if I can say with respect at the moment, for our troops to hear, the 39,000 that went to Afghanistan, those that have served in Iraq or in Middle Eastern campaigns in recent years, is that their country is incredibly proud of their service. I don't think those troops or their families, their loved ones, want to hear some political point scoring at this point in time. They want to hear that this country has their back, and this government does, and they want to hear, Mr Speaker, that their service in our country's name is in our national interest, and it is. And, Mr Speaker, we will continue to provide the resources to those troops, both those that are serving, those that have served, and we will make sure that we make the future investment decisions to give them the best capability to defend our nation. We do live in an uncertain time, and we do need to take tough decisions from time to time to make sure that we protect and keep safe the Australian population. The Prime Minister and the members of the Cabinet, the National Security Committee, will always make those decisions based on that criteria to keep our country safe and to make sure that we can protect and defend us as you would expect an elected government would do. And, Mr Speaker, we are well and truly served and greatly honoured by the service of the men and women of the Australian Defence Force and our other security and national intelligence agencies. I am extremely proud of the work that we're doing in Afghanistan at the moment in harm's way, and I wish Godspeed to all of those there. I want them back home safely as soon as possible.
The member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Less than half of residential aged care workers nationwide have been fully vaccinated against COVID. The Prime Minister said these people would be vaccinated by Easter 4 months ago. Isn't this abject failure by the Prime Minister putting vulnerable Australians at risk?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And in response to the member's question, at this point in time, 71.2% of residential aged care workers across Australia have received a first vaccination. All up, that's over 196,000 vaccinations which have occurred. In addition to that, 49.3% of those have received a second vaccination, or 136,000. What we are finding, in particular, is the combination of both vaccination of residents, which is the first line of protection. Over 88% of residents have had vaccinations, and all residents have had not just one but 2 visits at a minimum. And indeed, we continue to encourage families to vaccinate residents and to provide support. In addition to that, we have multiple channels for vaccination of workers, and we have worked with the sector, with unions, with others, with the states, to mandate so as to ensure that all of these workers do take up the opportunity. At this point in time, for the workers, we have primary care sites, we have state and territory vaccination centres, on-site clinics at residential aged care facilities, on-site clinics organised by residential aged care providers themselves, on-site clinics delivered by GPs or Commonwealth vaccine clinics, and dedicated vaccination clinics, of which there are 39 around the country, or hubs as they are known. All of these elements come together, and it is something where we are encouraging workers who have had access right through the course of the vaccination program to take up these options. And so we're using a mixture of in-reach and of outreach options. What we have seen is that as the decision of the National Cabinet has been put into effect through state public health orders progressively around the country, that there has been a significant increase in uptake, a significant increase in acceptance from these workers. These workers are doing a magnificent job, and I want to thank them and encourage them and continue to push forward. One of the things that we notice is that there has been a dramatic difference between what occurred in Victoria last year and what is occurring in New South Wales now. With comparable rates of infection, there are almost unimaginable differences in outcomes in our residential aged care facilities. So lives are being saved. Lives are being saved in their hundreds through that vaccination program of both workers and of residents. We thank all of the families, we thank all of the workers, and those who haven't come forward, we continue to encourage that vaccination to proceed.
And I call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on Australia's national plan on keeping Australians safe and healthy, vaccinating the population and reopening the economy through sound, scientific and health advice? The
Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I particularly want to acknowledge the member for Reid and her work in supporting mental health of children and young adolescents and people of all ages, but particularly at the paediatric levels. We know around the world that the pandemic continues to rage, almost 690,000 cases, and sometimes that fact is lost on some, that there is a global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in 100 years. Almost 10,000 lives lost again in the last 24 hours. We are blessed that no lives were lost in Australia to COVID in that time. But we will see more lives lost, we know that. Having said that, what we have also seen in the last 24 hours is 289,000 vaccinations. We have seen in the last week 1.82 million, over 1.8 million vaccinations. We have seen in August, with 23 days, or just over 3 weeks gone, over 5 million vaccinations delivered, or the population of Melbourne or Sydney in just over 3 weeks. And that's Australians stepping forward to be vaccinated. That is Australians doing something to protect each of themselves under the national plan, to bring us closer to those critical thresholds which were reaffirmed overnight by the Doherty Institute, both by the release of Professor McVernon and by the words which the Treasurer quoted of Sharon Lewin, who heads the Doherty Institute. And what we've also seen is that we are now at a point where 11 million Australians have had their first doses. 11 million Australians have stepped forward to be vaccinated. And significantly, a very important milestone is that we have 2.5 million of our older Australians who have now stepped forward. So we have 50%. For our over 50s, 75% have had vaccinations. For our over 60s, over 80%, and for our over 70s, we have significantly 85% of vaccinations. These are the things that are saving lives. These are the things that are protecting lives. And so what we see is that in a world with catastrophic human tragedy, we are not immune, but we have been largely protected against these global ravages. And right now, there are people who are doing it hard. Right now, we are facing the challenges that other parts of the world are facing. But right now, we are vaccinating on a grand scale, in addition to what we've done with borders and testing and tracing and distancing, those rings of containment. which is the Doherty Institute under the National Plan has set out, will progressively replace the need for those earlier containment rings.
And I call the member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm just over a quarter of eligible NDIS participants have been fully vaccinated and less than 40% of disability care workforce has been fully vaccinated? Given these people were meant to be prioritised for vaccination, why did this happen?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And in response to the member's question, one of our important achievements as a nation has been protecting people with a disability. The rate of cases in disability and the rate of lives lost in disability is approximately half, on the advice that I have, that of the national average. To think that we have, as a nation, been able to provide that protection is, I think, a very significant national achievement. But we're going to fight and continue to fight for every life. Every life. Every life. That's what matters. And so in terms of our disability resident vaccinations, we've now vaccinated 67.9% of disability residents with a first dose and 52.8% of residents with a second dose. In terms of NDIS participants, it's 46.1% of all participants who've had a first dose, 28.1% who've had a second dose. In terms of the disability workforce, this is growing very significantly, and that is now at 58% for first doses and 39.1% for second doses. I would also repeat my message from the in relation to the previous question asked by the opposition, and that is we need your help. We need your help and everybody's help to encourage those with disabilities to take up the opportunity, to have the confidence in the vaccines, to continue to come forward, because it's both about access, but it's also about confidence. And these are really important messages, to take these opportunities, for families to be providing consent. These are such critical steps forward, and each family, each person can help save a life. We thank our workers, we thank our families, we thank those people who are making their own decisions for coming forward. But we want to say to each and every person, this vaccine can save your life. Do not hesitate. Please take up the opportunity, because as we provide these opportunities, we know that we can do better still than what we've already achieved in the disability sector, where the rate of cases and the rate of loss is significantly and dramatically below the national average. That's an enormous achievement, but we're going to fight for every life.
And I give the call to the member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Australian Defence Force is continuing to bring back Australians and Australian visa holders from Afghanistan?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and really highlight the fact that not only has he served his country in uniform, but he is one of the greatest advocates in this place for men and women who serve in the uniform today. He's on the backbench committee for Defence and Veterans Affairs, and I work very closely with him, and I'm very grateful for his advice. Mr Speaker, we are all incredibly proud, of course, of the work of the Australian Defence Force personnel, our intelligence agencies, the Home Affairs staff, the DFAT personnel who are in Kabul right now, and they are saving lives, as we know. But it is important to recognise that they are working in perilous circumstances, as we know. There are credible threats in relation to the prospects of terrorist attacks. We know that ISKP and others have the intent to cause harm, not only to our people, to those Afghan nationals, to the Taliban itself, and it is a very, very dangerous situation. And, Mr Speaker, we have over 250 personnel across the different agencies who are supporting this effort, and since last Wednesday, in less than a week, we've been able to shift 1,700 people to safety, and that has only been possible because of the brave actions of many of those who serve our country this very day. And I want to recognise the family members and those mates who are here watching anxiously, their loved ones and their friends who are serving in Kabul at the moment. We want them to return home as quickly and as safely as possible. And, Mr Speaker, I was speaking again with the Chief of the Defence Force this morning, talking about our evacuation plans and ways in which we can move our equipment, our assets and, most importantly, our people out safely in a timely way. But we are in, obviously, the back end of this campaign now, and the situation does continue to deteriorate over the coming hours and in the next couple of days. Mr Speaker, I want to make sure that we can do everything that we can also to recognise as a government the efforts that have been made, particularly by the Home Affairs Department, but DFAT, Defence in recent months as well. It's been quite remarkable, the amount of people, the number of people that we've been able to bring out of Afghanistan since April, and indeed over the last 8 years. And I think most Australians recognise, and they realise this fact, that Australia is second only to Canada on a per capita basis, the numbers of people that we settle permanently under our refugee and humanitarian program in this country. And 8,500 people have come out of Afghanistan over the course of the last 8 years, and of course that is supplemented now by our current efforts, and there is and always will be more to do, and we commit ourselves to that task.
I call the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last week, Life Without Barriers vaccine hub for NDIS participants and disability workers in my electorate was shut with just 1 day's notice. This sudden closure caused immense distress, given local outbreaks in the disability sector and the appalling rates of vaccination among Australians with a disability. Would this be happening if the Prime Minister had done his job and fully vaccinated this vulnerable cohort by Easter like he said he would?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for her question, although respectfully disagree with the presumption contained within it. We know the Life Without Barriers hub well. It was one of a series of pop-up clinics to service certain parts before they would then move on to other areas once a high vaccination rate had been achieved as a result. They actually did their job. They did their job magnificently. And I want to thank everybody involved with the Life Without Barriers hub, which, as the member well knows, has served the Newcastle community well. I am surprised, however, that either the member is not aware or neglected to mention in her question that a new hub opened on the 23rd of August in Wallsend, Newcastle, and anyone with an existing booking has been advised of the new hub location. This was done to make sure, precisely on the advice of the disability community, that there was additional access in another area within the same region on a more proximate basis. It is unfortunate that that was neglected, either consciously or through other reasons, from the presumptions in the question. But I would also add that an additional Newcastle hub will be opening on the 30th of August. A hub with further down with Coastlink in Woy Woy will open on the 3rd of September, and a hub in Tuggerah will open on the 6th of September, showing the nature of these hubs. The Life Without Barriers hub at Newcastle operated from the 22nd of June to the 20th of August. During this time, the provider administered over 5,000 doses. The Commonwealth provider is Aspen Medical. And so, on their advice and on the basis of the assessment, it was then moved to another point in Newcastle, precisely in line with the intention, the plan and the process, to ensure as many people as possible have the best access as possible, in addition to state clinics, Commonwealth clinics, in addition to GPs and in addition to pharmacies.
The member for Goldstein.
Well, thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's continuing delivery of assistance to help resettle Afghan nationals,
And can the minister outline how the government is also ensuring the security of our borders and the safety of all Australians?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, I thank the member for his question, and as we've recognised over the last few days, in particular here in this place, the situation in Afghanistan is deeply concerning. It's concerning for us here in this place, and it is concerning for people right across this nation. Now, our government has been very focused on the safe departure of Australian citizens, permanent residents and visa holders, including Afghan former locally engaged employees. Now, we have worked very swiftly across various departments, various agencies. This has been a whole-of-government response to the situation in Afghanistan. And we have had many people on the ground and here in Australia, quite frankly, working around the clock 24/7 to provide the support that is needed to assist those individuals in Afghanistan. Now, since the 18th of August, Australia has evacuated more than 1,600 people from Afghanistan over some 17 flights. And we've achieved this by working very closely with the United States and the United Kingdom, amongst other nations. Here in Australia, we are also working very closely with the Afghan community. We're working with them so that we can identify particularly some suitable applicants for the humanitarian program. We are looking to support those people who come from persecuted minorities, who have links to Australia, who have shown a commitment to Australia, sometimes over many, many years. Now, we do have a very strong Afghan community in Australia. We've had that community here for many, many, many years, back from the days where people from that region came to Australia and they settled in outback Australia. Now, more recently, we've provided resettlement opportunities to about 8,500 Afghan nationals, and that does include 1,900 locally engaged employees and their families who have supported our mission. Now, one of the things that we've been very focused on with the processing of applications, particularly on the ground in Kabul, is making sure that as many checks are done as possibly can. I think it's fair to say that this government has always taken national security particularly seriously, and we have been doing all that we can to make sure that the appropriate checks are being put in place to assist with the timely uplift of people from Afghanistan to Australia. We will continue to do that. We will continue to work around the clock in Australia to support that mission, to support the evacuation, so that we can safely bring as many people out of Afghanistan and on their way to Australia. What I can say to the Australian people is that they can have confidence in the Morrison government that we will be doing all we can to make sure that we repatriate people, bring them here as soon as we possibly can in a safe manner.
And I'll give the call to the member for Barton.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Just 15% of First Nations Australians are fully vaccinated, about half the rate of the general population. With outbreaks in First Nations communities in New South Wales, will the Prime Minister acknowledge his failure to do his job on vaccines and quarantine have left these vulnerable Australians at risk?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and for her keen interest in this area and for her support, working with the government wherever we can to try and boost the uptake of vaccines amongst our Indigenous population. The first dose vaccination of our Indigenous population is 33.31% and the second dose is 17.83%. And that is indeed lower than the overall level of vaccinations of our adult population over the age of 16. This has been a very keen area of concern for the government right from the outset, and the Indigenous communities have been one of our most vulnerable communities. And the work that is being done in Western New South Wales in particular, I want to commend all of those, from the ADF to the clinicians and others who are working there, and I know the member would also be positively assisting in those efforts. And I will ask the Minister for Indigenous Australians to update further on our progress.
The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Our work is focused on the
where we have significant gaps. There have been plenty of supplies provided to the Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations across the nation. And in particular in western regions of New South Wales and in the western suburbs of Sydney, there are coordinating groups that are working together to ensure that we increase the rates of vaccination. And to date, we've seen the hesitancy sort of slip away and people becoming much more concerned. We're also looking at the movement of people. As the member for Franklin would know, people living in Western Sydney often have family connections back to their home places in Brewarrina and along the river towns, and they have gone back to those regions, and inadvertently there's a possibility that that COVID spread has been extended further. But also, the member for Barton, sorry, but I also want to say that the work that we're doing is significant in the way in which we are working with community on the ground and making sure that the information flow is going through to community. But what we're also seeing is community coming together and working with the two health systems, both the Commonwealth and state, and Pat Turner is leading a coordinating committee under the auspices of the Minister for Health, and there is a targeted plan to ensure that we reach as many people across New South Wales as possible, and that plan is focusing on targeting those areas where there are low vaccination rates. What's good is people are now coming forward, and listening to Jamie Newman from Orange this morning, he also outlined the need for additional people on the ground to help increase those vaccination rates. So government is working very closely across both jurisdictions with community to ensure a better outcome than what we've seen in the past.
I now give the call to the member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting veterans and their families impacted on the situation in Afghanistan?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel.
Well, I thank the member for Herbert for his question, for his service to Australia in uniform, and also for his subsequent advocacy work for veterans in his area and around Australia. Mr Speaker, over the last week the world has been watching the terrible humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Afghanistan. This has been a distressing time for many of our Defence Force personnel and veterans who served in Afghanistan with courage, dignity and honour. We will never forget the 41 Australians who made the ultimate sacrifice, including Lance Corporal Jared McKinney, who lost his life while helping a mate during a firefight with the Taliban on this day 11 years ago. Known as Crash to his mates, Jared was a husband and a father. He was just 28. Our hearts go out to Becky and Jared's family. Mr Speaker, our nation needs to acknowledge the men and women of the ADF and their veterans, but also their families, because their families have sacrificed and continue to sacrifice so much to support their loved ones and their country. We owe those family members an enormous debt of gratitude as well. Last week I held roundtables with ex-service organisations and also with our younger veterans, including many who served in Afghanistan. We discussed veteran support and also how our younger veterans viewed their time in Afghanistan. The consensus from those that were there was clear. Our ADF members made a real difference in Afghanistan, and they know that their time was successful and that it meant something. They went to stamp out terrorism and fight for freedom, and they acquitted themselves in the finest tradition of the Australian Armed Services. We'll never know how many horrific terrorist attacks around the world were prevented by their efforts and those of our allies. They made life better for the people of Afghanistan. As one veteran said last week, every single one of us that went knows the difference we made on the ground when we were over there. Last week, Mr Speaker, I directed the Department of Veterans Affairs to contact the family members of ADF members who'd lost their loved ones in Afghanistan and all veterans who could be suffering adversely from what has happened there. 33,000 open arms counselling clients and 287,000 veterans and family members were messaged, providing them with the support numbers of 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week counselling. I would encourage any veteran or family member, no matter where they served, to reach out for support if they need it. And in these times of lockdown and isolation, Mr Speaker, there is something that we can all do. Pick up the phone and say good day to a veteran. A friendly voice over the phone can make all the difference. Mr Speaker, we want our veterans to know that our country is proud of them and that we will always be there for them.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Firstly, Mr Speaker, I just associate the opposition with the comments of the Minister with regard to the need to provide support for our veterans at what must be a very difficult time for them.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. In April, Labor wrote to the Health Minister concerned about staff shortages at the Dubbo Aboriginal Medical Service and the vaccine rollout to local First Nations people. The Health Minister's office inexplicably replied that international medical graduates could be recruited despite the international borders being closed. Given the significant outbreak amongst First Nations people around Dubbo right now, does the Prime Minister regret not doing more to protect this community?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and to the Leader of the Opposition. This is and has been one of our priorities. The achievements in protecting Indigenous Australia through the course of the pandemic have been one of the signatures of the Australian result. As the Prime Minister says, acknowledged by Pat Turner, acknowledged by Indigenous communities, and it's a considerable and ongoing task. One of the things in particular in relation to the Western New South Wales outbreak, and in Dubbo in particular, is that we have established 5 ADF teams. Those ADF teams include being based in Dubbo, and if I may, their current work over the coming days is we have teams that will rotate between Burke and Warren, Dubbo West and Parks, Dubbo West, Narromine, Parks, Dubbo West, Parks, Trangie, Grawin, Ningen, Coolah, Mudgee, Forbes, Lightning Ridge, and across the region. That ADF work, though, is also supported by 50 ADF members who have moved to be Dubbo-based and working out of Western New South Wales to focus in particular on compliance and assistance within the region. And then further, an AUSMAT team has been landed, and that is the first of 5 teams. That AUSMAT team is ensuring that we have clinical governance. They will vaccinate, they will work on testing, but above all else they are there to ensure that any support which is needed for any of the health services in the area, is put in place. In addition to that, the Royal Flying Doctor Service is also providing assistance and vaccination across the area. Over the course of this week, their forward schedule includes Menindee, Hungerford, Yunta, Ivanhoe, Louth, Wenaring, Euston, Tibooburra. That's over the course of the coming week. And so what we are seeing is that the resources are in place. They are adding to that which is already there, and we have the ADF, we have the Royal Flying Doctor Service, we have AUSMAT, and all of that supports the existing clinics that are on the ground. My recollection, this is correct, I believe, is that there are 118 Commonwealth clinics in Western New South Wales, and that includes both 9 Commonwealth vaccination clinics and 9 Aboriginal community-controlled health services, as well as 100 pharmacies and general practice clinics that are providing vaccination support on the ground. All of these things are coming together to save lives and to protect lives.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table the correspondence from Senator Deb O'Neill, the duty Labor senator for the area, asking that the Minister fully staff the Dubbo Aboriginal Medical Service, and also, well, you can't just stand up.
The Leader of the House can resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
And the response saying, as such, practices can recruit doctors subject to location restrictions such as international medical graduates and Australian bonded doctors.
No, the Leader of the Opposition will not. He's had his question. No, you just. Yeah, that's right. You're seeking leave to table documents. You need to briefly describe what they are, not read them in their entirety into Hansard, which begs the question why you then want them tabled. the Leader of the House, leave is not granted. The member for COWPER.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. Will the Minister update the House on what action the Morrison-Joyce government is taking to protect regional, rural and remote Australians in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Regional Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. First of all, I'd like to thank the member for COWPER for his question and compliment him on the sterling job he's doing looking after the good constituents in COWPER. Look, whether it's in the far east at Norfolk Island or the far west at Cocos Island, up in Wilcannia, down the Darling River or down in the seat of Nichols, there is Commonwealth support rolling out around Australia, delivering the vaccines that everyone knows is the quickest way to get back to our normal way of life or near normal and get rid of lockdowns. Of the 1.8 million vaccines delivered in the last week, 502,000 were delivered in regional Australia, outside the big cities. There are 4.6 million doses that have already gone into regional Australians, like in your electorate, the member for COWPER. We have had a coordinated plan involving regional and remote Australia from the very beginning in the early planning sessions of the COVID pandemic. Currently, there are 2,541 community or primary care sites in regional Australia. The Aboriginal community control health organisations have been front and centre of that. In fact, there's 127 of them fighting COVID with vaccine rollout. We have 73 Commonwealth vaccination centres in regional Australia. The workhorse of vaccine delivery has been 1,518 general practices, including in your electorate, in my electorate, in the far west, north, south, around the country. And we now have 823 community pharmacies who have joined the fight to get that vaccine rollout. And I compliment the Minister for Health's comments about the ADF and AUSMAT teams. They are out there on the ground, in the seat of Nichols, in the seat of Parkes, helping everyone else. We have been coordinating with state agencies so that everything is coordinated. I'd like to give a particular shout-out to the people in Dubbo, in particular Cale Bone, who works at the Terry White Chemmart in Delroy Park in West Dubbo. He's been vaccinating day in, day out for a couple of weeks now, delivering AstraZeneca. But on the weekend he got a bus out to the Apollo Estate in East Dubbo, where he knows a lot of people, and going door to door. He acknowledges there has been vaccine hesitancy, but they're coming out now. People in country Australia, they band together, they're rolling up their sleeves, rolling out. There's big queues, but they know the quickest way to get COVID back in the box and get our normal way of life back together is to get mass vaccination rolled out, and it's certainly happening in regional, rural and remote Australia.
And I give the call to the member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. On the 24th of June, the Minister told the House that having no Australian in ICU due to COVID was the real measure of the government's success. So is having over 110 Australians in ICU today a measure of the government's failure?
The Minister for Health.
The world has faced a pandemic the likes of which we haven't seen in 100 years. Australia's achievements have been extraordinary, but we've not been immune. Last year we faced a devastating outbreak in Victoria. Where lives were lost on a significant basis. This year, as we're seeing, as I say, with almost 690,000 cases worldwide yesterday and almost 10,000 lives 10,000 souls lost yesterday. We're also not immune. But every life saved, the 30,000 lives saved compared with the OECD average, the 45,000 lives saved compared with the United States and the UK average, is a profound gift of life that is something that we should be acknowledging. And every life lost is a tragedy. So there is an outbreak. We know that. It's not a game, it's life and death for people. And what that means is, yes, there are, at this point in time, 119 Australians in ICU. There are 44 Australians on ventilation, 670 Australians in hospital. It's important to acknowledge the challenge that each one of them and their families face. But it's important to acknowledge that what we have done as a nation, in the midst of a pandemic, and sometimes it does appear and feel as if there are those that would airbrush a global pandemic and pretend this is an Australian phenomenon. It's not. What we see is a pandemic which has ravaged and ripped apart so much of the world, which has been present in Australia, but on a vastly different basis. So those things that we've done, the rings of containment, the borders, the testing, the tracing, the distancing, yes, they have made those differences. Is it different with Delta? Yes, it is. As we see with the United States having over 130,000 cases a day, as we see with the UK having over 30,000 cases a day, as we see with almost 100 lives lost daily in the UK now. So this pandemic evolves and it throws new challenges. But do I think we're up for it as a nation? I do. Do I think what we are doing will protect Australians? Absolutely. Do I think the national plan is fundamental? Absolutely. As Pat McGorry was saying in terms of mental health in the last 2 days, these things give Australians hope, and hope is what is fundamental to help people through these difficult times, and that's what we're doing, hope and safety.
I give the call to the member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting the childcare sector by keeping services open for essential care, keeping staff employed and easing financial pressure on families?
The Minister for Education.
Can I thank the member for Wentworth for his question? He's a former diplomat and now the member for Wentworth, an incredible advocate for his childcare centres in his electorate. Mr Speaker, as the member knows and everybody in this House knows, childcare is a critical part of our economy and our society. There's almost 1 million families rely on the childcare system, and it's particularly important at the moment for those essential workers. There's 200,000 people that work in the childcare system, and many of them are owned by small family businesses, Mr Speaker. And I just want to say at the outset, thank you to all of those providers for continuing on the work that you are doing. It is an essential, essential work that you are doing, providing valuable services for all of us. Now, Mr Speaker, during the pandemic, we've been constantly monitoring the financial situation with the childcare providers to ensure that they can remain strong and viable and open. Up until just yesterday, we'd already provided $3 billion of additional support since the beginning of this pandemic. But even over the last few weeks, we've been noticing attendance levels, particularly in Greater Sydney, continue to fall as the lockdown went on. And then, Mr Speaker, over the weekend, both New South Wales and Victoria gave additional health directives that children should not be attending childcare centres unless they were children of essential workers, which of course has further impact on those childcare centres. So consequently, we stepped up yesterday and we announced new additional support for those childcare services. And, Mr Speaker, that's an additional 25% of revenue going to the childcare centres, and it's an additional 40% of revenue which goes to the out-of-school hour care providers as well. And of course, this is on top of the childcare subsidy, Mr Speaker, which will continue to flow even if the children aren't attending. That keeps those childcare centres open. That keeps them viable. That means that they can continue to be open for those essential workers which need those services in order to go to the hospitals to do their work, in order to be out in the community serving us and keeping us safe, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I just want to finally come back to my thanks to the childcare workers. They are very important workers. We've made this funding conditional upon the headcounts being maintained, and we've also made the funding conditional upon the gap fee waivers being put into place. That is, you only access the funding if parents aren't charged. Parents won't be charged, but will continue the flow of funding. Mr Speaker, this is a good package. It's good for the childcare operators, it's good for the families, and it's good for the workers.
Has concluded. I'll give the call to the member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Speaker. My question again is to the Minister for Health. Will the government include children between the ages of 12 and 15 in vaccination targets before the country reopens? And I put the question that is being asked by parents in lockdown zones across Australia. Will parents be asked to send their secondary school children back to school before they're vaccinated?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Hindmarsh. It will be guided by the scientific advisers in relation to the assessment of the national plan. That plan has been reaffirmed overnight by the Doherty Institute, both by the head of the Doherty Institute, Professor Sharon Lewin, and also by Professor Jodie McVernon, the chief modeller, in her release, which was put out. In terms of the allocation of people for the 70% and 80% targets, the advice to us remains very clear. Having been put to the Doherty Institute on a number of occasions as to whether or not that should include children under 16 as part of that, the advice is that the correct target for Australia, the appropriate and necessary target, should be the 16+ adult population on the basis of the transmissibility. That's the scientific advice to Australians. In addition to that, we will continue with the program in relation to 12 to 15-year-olds. There are two stages. Firstly, at this point in time, we've vaccinated approximately 8,000 of those that were opened up only recently, following the medical advice of the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation to provide vaccinations for children with disability, children with underlying medical conditions, children in Indigenous communities and children in remote communities. They will, of course, be recorded and done in addition to the national program. And then, right now, we are awaiting the advice, which we hope will be with us in the course of the week, from the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation for general 12 to 15-year-old vaccinations. And if they advise, we will do it. I would hope that nobody is advocating that we should be vaccinating people for whom there's no medical advice. I would hope nobody is advocating that, because there was an implication in the question. Having said that,
members on my left.
And in relation to students, 16 and above, 12 to 15 is a secondary cohort. 16 and above is also a secondary cohort. In relation to 16 and above, bookings open as of the 30th of August. So that was already foreshadowed last week by the Prime Minister. The secondary age goes from 12 through to 18. So two cohorts within that group. And then perhaps, as we look at all of this, one of the things is we purchased vaccines for whole of population. And what the point about whole of population is to cover all possible contingencies of all age groups. And we are in that situation with 16 plus opening up next week. Matters for school attendance are a matter for the relevant state governments. But we hope that if there is a target advice, all states and territories will join with us in the national rollout of 12 to 15-year-olds.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is addressing the scourge of domestic and family violence, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Higgins for her question, thank her for the work she does in her electorate across so many fronts. She's well known for her Go Girls forums, which support women's pathways into leadership, and her STEM Superstars forums, where she showcases the achievements of women in STEM. More importantly, perhaps, as a public health professor and paediatrician for over 25 years, the member for Higgins has been a champion for children, and children are often the silent victims of domestic and family violence. Mr Speaker, previously people who considered that their lives were in perfect equilibrium are struggling with the circumstances of this global pandemic. So now more than ever, we must be aware of the situation for those for whom home is no longer a safe place to be. COVID has continued to put pressure on our families and our living situations. Despite ongoing lockdowns, there is never an excuse for violence. Everyone deserves to be safe in their home, their workplace and their community. And we want to make sure that a lockdown should never be a reason that women and children can't find the help they need. Acting quickly, the Morrison government provided $150 million to our frontline services at the start of the pandemic. That included a first tranche of $130 million to the states and territories to help them with their frontline services, and $20 million to our Commonwealth services, including 1800 Respect. And I do want to take the opportunity to thank those frontline workers, the social workers, the crisis accommodation providers, the 1800 Respect counsellors, for their ongoing efforts to truly change the trajectory of women and children escaping violence. And we know too that victim survivors of domestic and family violence need support throughout their journey, not just at the moment of crisis. Children deserve to be safe and supported through their pursuit of justice and family law processes. Services such as the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service in New South Wales works with frontline crisis workers to ensure safe and sustainable outcomes for the victim survivors, and we really want to thank them. We are continuing on so many fronts with our determination, Mr Speaker, that as we develop the next national plan, we don't leave anyone behind. And I know that everyone in this parliament would want to urge those who feel unsafe in their homes to reach out for support. Your safety and your well-being matters. Lockdowns, curfews, rules and regulations should never prevent you leaving your home if you need to, escaping from harm, seeking help. The Morrison government will continue on all our efforts and fronts to end the scourge of domestic and family violence.
The Prime Minister.
Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and I'm sure the Leader of the Opposition would join me in welcome